But
no,
and it looks like we're gonna have to do a part 2 because you got to go soon. But I do want to ask you some very specific things about the documentary. What
sure.
can you and you can respond to me and then answer this question. Can you pinpoint something in the documentary that stood out maybe the most to you in terms of some of the issues that you or bones you have to pick with this discourse on gender?
Yeah, there were two. There were 2 or 3 interviews in there that sort of struck me as extremely strange. One of them being I forgot. I believe she was a gender affirming. What's it called? Pediatrician. The one with the green hair.
My name is Michelle Forcier, and I have a medical degree from University of Connecticut, residency, University of Utah Pediatrics, and I've worked for a number of different Planned Parenthoods for 20 years. I do advanced contraception and abortion, as well as gender hormones, and sort of looking at the whole sort of schema of gender, sex, and reproductive justice.
So you've done.
So that was probably one of the more disturbing interviews within the actual documentary, and this was because of her outright refusal to acknowledge any sort of biological reality as far as sex and how it typically expresses. Well, not typically, really, almost in almost every case. Has a certain set of biological criteria that go along with the delineation between man and woman. Specifically, when Matt Walsh asked her, would it be wrong to assume that a chicken is female if I saw it lay eggs?
If I see a chicken laying eggs and I say that's a female chicken laying eggs, did I assign female, or am I just observing a physical reality that's happening in the world?
Does a chicken have gender identity? Does a chicken cry?
Well,
Does a chicken commit suicide? Let's frame it, because you're trying
to... Chicken has sex like any biological organism.
A chicken has an assigned gender, but a chicken doesn't have a gender identity.
So we assign female to chickens when they lay eggs?
We assume they're female if they lay eggs.
And her immediate deflection was, hey, do chickens have feelings? Do chickens cry? Do chickens have depression? Or do they try to commit suicide? Which I thought was, it's such a simple question. And I think the reason why he asked it was so that he'd be able to point out to a quite frankly, a ridiculous answer in order to avoid making the concession that, okay, yeah, well, there are certain things that we can use as actual markers to define whether someone is a male or female. I think that speaks to the confusion that's happening now between like gender and sex, whereas before we were able to say, like, all right, well, there's sex and then there's gender, and now I'm seeing it happen very slowly. Maybe it's just me. I don't think it is, but the definitions of those two are starting to bleed into each other, and they're starting to just become interchangeable. And I think that's a huge problem, especially with someone who's actually treating children and has to make actual decisions whether or not she would administer drugs like Lupron.
One of the drugs used is Lupron, right? Which has actually been used to chemically castrate sex offenders.
You know what? I'm not sure that we should continue with this interview because it seems like it's going in a particular direction.
Well, you're a medical professional.
I am a medical professional.
So you don't want to talk about the drugs that you give to kids, or?
Again, I'm a physician and I use medication. You're choosing exploitive words. Drugs I give to kids.
I'm choosing a
chemical
word that was in a dictionary.
That's not a correct term for puberty blocking.
I could look it up on my phone, but I'm pretty sure if I looked it up,
you can look it up on your phone.
It says medical definition: the administration of a drug to bring about a marked reduction in the body's production of androgens and especially testosterone.
And I'm saying, as a pediatrician who takes care of hundreds of these kids, when you use that terminology, you are being malignant and harmful.
I mean, there are some who would say that giving chemical castration drugs to kids is malignant and harmful.
It's about the context of caring for a child and seeing the the suffering that kids can have that have not been in affirmative home situations.
Which she avoided completely the subject once it was brought up. And she makes claims about the reversibility of these procedures.
At what age does the medical transition begin with medication?
So medical affirmation begins when the patient says they're ready for it. So that could be a kiddo who is just starting puberty and panicking because they're getting breast buds or their penis is getting bigger and busier and they're worried about all kinds of masculine changes. And that way, puberty blockers, which are completely reversible and don't have permanent effects, are wonderful because we can put that pause on puberty. Just like if you were listening to music, you put the pause on and we stop the blockers and puberty would go right back to where it was. The next note in the song just delayed that period of time.
I think that's a very dangerous thing, for children. I think if you're an adult, you should be able to do it. You own your own body, and if you think this will help you, and if you make a mistake, that's on you. If you don't make a mistake, I'm glad for you. But the fact that this is the person that's making decisions for children, I think is quite worrisome.
Fair. I mean, I feel you. I felt the tension that you felt too. And you know me, I gotta try my best to steel man things.
Of course.
I will say that I do think it is more complicated. There are some complexities that we need to take into account. One is, from my limited understanding as a non-expert, if you allow a person to mature into adulthood, and there's no, let's call them medically safe interventions done with respect to that natural process of development into a mature, let's say you're a biological, what's the term? The sex assigned at birth. I know you're annoyed by this, but I'm trying to accommodate the discourse. The sex assigned at birth of the person in question was male, and this person experiences gender dysphoria and identifies as a woman. If you allow the process of maturation all the way until they're 18 without any kind of intervention, puberty blockers, or anything like that, then they're gonna reach a point in their maturation where the processes that are necessary, the interventions that are necessary at that point, are going to be way more intrusive. And so they're going to require more surgeries and things like that. So that's an example of something that's more intrusive. But if you give them puberty blockers and things like that and delay those things or stop those things in the first place, then there's less intrusive things that they would have to undergo in order to be able to have their body, insofar as they want to at 18, conform to the identity, their gender identity, their preferred gender identity, or the gender identity that they feel that they are, whatever the most accurate way to describe that, consistent with people who sincerely hold these views, is. And so that is a kind of complex thing. Part of the controversy is whether you even buy the initial premises in the first place, and I don't think that you do. But what I'm trying to articulate is that actually is a position that I've heard people on this side articulate. And so one of the reasons why they're really, really interested in having teenagers in being introduced to puberty blockers and things like that in the first place is for that reason. There are practical considerations in terms of that, and what they do, because the surgeries are themselves riskier than a lot of these other things as well. So a lot of these people, not every one of them, I would argue, but a lot of these people are actually operating in good faith. They may be mistaken, but they're operating in good faith because what they're trying to do is they're trying to maximize the ability of a person who genuinely experiences gender dysphoria and genuinely wants to transition eventually, maximize the ability to do that in the least intrusive way and the least medically risky way.
Yeah, I think that last part, especially the medically risky way, I think that is something that's being thrown by the wayside. I don't think there's enough evidence
in all cases, or some cases.
In most cases, if you're administrating, these, quite frankly, experimental procedures on children, in which we don't really quite understand what it will do to them in the long term. And as far as what we know so far, there is very little. There's actually a lot more evidence that it actually causes permanent damage. And we're seeing, for example, communities of tens of thousands of of people who've decided to reverse their gender assignment surgeries or their hormone therapy. There aren't that many trans people. It's a very rare occurrence. So it's probably in like
But
the
how would
hundreds
you
of
know if
thousands.
how
I
would you
mean, we
know
have,
if they're not coming out and identifying because of the persecution they fear they might have to
well,
endure?
that's the thing. It's like we have the society that has probably the most acceptance, as far as we know, uh, of transgender people anywhere on the planet. Perhaps the only one
The same
rivaling it
society
would
that
be
made this
Thailand.
"What Is a Woman" documentary is the most accepting of trans people.
Of the gender ideology, absolutely. It's like this one
The
in
same
Canada.
society that is banning trans people in sports is the same society that is the most accepting of trans people.
I mean, in New York, it's illegal to misgender someone as an institution, and so it
That's
is.
true.
So is
That's
it
true. That's
in
true. There,
Canada.
there are
Like,
pockets of our society, but what I'm trying to get you to do is be careful about the overgeneralization, because there are pockets of our society that are antithetical to it as well. And so,
sure,
if you're going to make the general claim that this is the most trans inclusive society, it's like,
yeah,
I
but
don't know about that.
that's also relative, because if we're talking about pockets in other societies, those pockets are
No.
non-existent
I'm
or
talking about
minuscule.
no. Let me clarify. With respect to the United States specifically, right?
Hmm.
There are a lot of places where it's like being trans and non-binary. You're gonna be very supported because the political milieu and the cultural milieu surrounding that place, places like New York, places like here in San Francisco where I live, are conducive to it because a lot of people recognize the value of the support because it minimizes in their minds, and I think this is probably generally true. It minimizes the likelihood that people will be driven to suicide or will endure all of the kinds of forms of persecution they otherwise would endure from people who don't understand. But there are other pockets of our society, stereotypically places like in the South, deep red states, the countryside, Bible Belt, etc., where not so much. That's not going to be accepted, and so you're liable to be ridiculed and get all the forms of persecution that are associated with being trans and non-binary, being regarded as weird, being discriminated against, being ostracized socially, etc. If you're trans or non-binary, and so to say that the whole society of the United States as a whole is the most inclusive of trans people is not quite accurate, or like not properly attentive to the nuance I'm trying to describe, if that makes sense.
Well, if we're comparing the overall sentiment here to other societies across the world, um, even if it is in certain pockets, even if it is not necessarily uniform in this country, the overall sentiment, if you were to sort of quantify it, would be much higher than almost anywhere else on the planet. And I think we can both agree on that. And that was like in relation to other places.
I mean, maybe it depends on it would depend on the places you're comparing it to, but I think I understand what you're saying better enough to agree with the general sentiment you're saying. I'll
Yeah.
partially agree.
Um,
But I'm just attentive to that
so
nuance. But okay, so go ahead. I wanted you to finish your thought.
yeah. So yeah. My point is to see that there are people who regret these sorts of decisions, and to see that there are actual consequences that would completely bar someone. For example, a young girl would breast removed, and you know her what's it called her gonads like affected by chemical castration, or think drugs like Lupron, which impede the full development of her sexual this is something that I think a person who's not able to legally get a tattoo because it's deemed as something that is a permanent change that you may not have the mental faculty to undertake quite yet. I think that's a very dangerous combination, and I think it actually, in my opinion, it violates the Hippocratic oath of doing no harm, because I don't think you know enough to
Well,
know whether or
there's
not this is harm. Like, you cannot give me the
I
argument
understand.
and
I
prove that
understand.
you are not harming this person, and I think
Okay,
that
I,
by
I
itself
think
is a violation of that oath.
I think an argument can be given. I don't know that you'll find it convincing, and so this may fall by the wayside. But there's a couple of things I want to point out. There's something about the comparison that is not, in terms of, and again, this is filtered through the limitations of my understanding. In terms of what I think people are trying to convey about the importance of doing this stuff, transitioning people, putting young children on puberty blockers, etc. There's a little bit of a disanalogy if you're going to compare it to getting a tattoo, because the purpose of getting a tattoo is, a tattoo in some sense is a kind of adornment on one's body. It isn't really about one's identity. it isn't really about one's conception of themselves, or at least not essentially. It can in some sense be a part of your identity insofar as the significance of whatever the tattoo is symbolizes a facet of your personality or something like that. I don't know that people identify with their tattoos in the way that they identify as a man or a woman. And so that part of the analogy is a little bit uneven. And so it makes the comparison a little strained. But the part that the point that you're making, I do want to recognize the validity of it. I do understand what you're saying in terms of like the logic of the permanence of the change being done. And there is an irreducible inability to predict whether or not this person will regret this permanent change or want to change their minds later. And we do have a whole bunch of cases of people who quote unquote detransition. And so this makes this decision a really high stakes decision. And I think your contention, and a lot of the contention of people who agree with you, is that if we, as a matter of medical practice, are allowing minors to make permanent decisions with respect to their body that they may change their mind about or come to regret later, and we're in some sense encouraging this because the latest and greatest of medical science says it's a good thing when it may not necessarily be, and actually a lot of medical research is being done to suggest that it actually might not be the best option for children that young, then we need to think twice about it. I think that's the point you're making, and I recognize the validity of it. However, there are cases where people actually do end up going on to not regret it, and they end up kind of, so to speak, living the rest of their lives to the best of their abilities, like anybody else. I wouldn't say they live happily ever after, live perfect lives, because nobody does. But there are success stories, and the success stories are being ignored or downplayed by a lot of people who are emphasizing the risks involved. So there's that. But two, if you're gonna have a success story, then you would want to start earlier rather than later. And I know that the cutoff point for making decisions like this is adulthood at 18, but that doesn't coincide with the natural physical development of puberty, etc. Right? Puberty starts before 18. So that's one of the reasons why I think people are trying to advocate that this happens younger, even though there's a tension that we have in our society between two sets of norms. One set of norms is these kinds of decisions are left to legal adults at 18, but they're trying to take into account the kind of medical biological factor of puberty, which starts as young as 10 years old, right? And so how do you weigh all of that? I'm not pretending to have all the answers, but what I am trying to do is give us a better appreciation for all of the nuances involved, so to make this a little bit more of a all-encompassing kind of thing. Because I think that a lot of people will come away from this documentary thinking that there is no possible justification for doing anything to children that young. And I'm trying to establish that actually there are medically necessitated rational grounds for looking to do this. But I do hear your point about whether or not these rational medical grounds are being weighed properly against the high stakes nature of the decision. And that's kind of me being a moderate, kind of me splitting the difference.
No, I appreciate that. And, I think even beyond the detransitioning or changing your mind consequences, there are physical, consequences like early onset cancer or infections.
Osteoporosis is another potential drawback of taking particular forms of puberty blockers if you take too much. And there's actually been a case of somebody who got osteoporosis really bad.
She was very young too.
Right. So yeah, there are, but the reason, so we need to have this discussion like this in a mature way that is in some sense tracking the facts to the best of our ability. And there may be some things that I fudged because I'm not an expert. I tried to lead with that, but we can't be taboo to question the decision to transition kids, and we can't be being slandered as transphobic for asking serious, good faith questions about whether or not this is a good idea in terms of standard medical practice. On the other hand, though, those who typically lean right-centered need to be able to have these, like, be able to engage in good faith with some of the considerations about like the nature of identity itself, which is actually like really like hard to talk about in ways that deviate from a lot of the preconceived notions that we have and expectations that we have surrounding men and women. Like people are very deeply uncomfortable with that because it interferes with their conception of themselves. It interferes with what they've learned to expect from their children. And a lot of people are being protective of their children understandably so, but from different political starting points and different philosophical starting points. Some people want to protect their children in the sense of, I want to be able to make sure that my child's trans identity is affirmed as early as possible, so that they don't have to go through all the negative outcomes of not having it affirmed. They're protective in that sense, and they're pro transitioning. Then you have people who want to be protective of, I don't want my child to be indoctrinated with this weird ideology and being tricked into thinking that there's something that they're not, and then being encouraged to undergo a whole bunch of permanent surgeries and transitionary things and puberty blockers and things like that because they're confused, right? And so I'm being protective of that. So like everybody's being protective, but they're starting from different philosophical starting points, and we're talking past each other because we're not really trying to account for what the other side is saying. I've talked too much. I want to let you have the last word, then we'll get you out of here.